Welcome back, AP Psychos. So today we're going to be talking about the topic of consciousness, which is our next unit, right? And the goal for this podcast is just to kind of introduce the idea of consciousness, define it, and describe how it influences our attention. And then the next couple of podcasts after that, we'll talk about particular states of consciousness and how those kind of interact and how your brain and mind and body kind of all work together in this unit. So kind of taking ourselves back for a minute, I need to just define consciousness, right? Consciousness is your awareness of yourself and like your environment. And this is kind of something we talked about at the beginning where I talked about the difference between like the mind and the brain, where like the brain is the physical structure and the mind is like your, like the way that we speak about like the idea of your mind and who you are and like what it encompasses. And so consciousness is kind of like that, where it's not like something you can touch or hold. It's kind of a construct that is a little bit gushy, right? It's a little bit hard to talk about because we don't really know exactly what we're talking about, but we know in terms of psychology that it's our awareness of ourselves and our environment. And how we know where your awareness is driven by where you're paying attention to. So consciousness is a continuum in that it's not just either you're conscious or you're unconscious, which I think a lot of times we think about, but there are lots of different levels of awareness in between highly alert, kind of like, frightened or, vigilantly paying attention to something, and like being in a coma, right? And so if you look at this picture over here, these kind of are some different examples of normal waking consciousness. So really focused attention, kind of just being awake. Maybe your attention is divided between, you're trying to multitask. An alcohol-induced state is an example of an altered consciousness, daydreaming, being under hypnosis, sleep, being anesthetized, and being in a coma. And some of these things are natural, like daydream or divided attention, and some of these is sleep, and some of these things are induced, like meditation or an alcohol or drug-induced state. So actually, although consciousness is really hard to talk about because you can't really touch it or hold it, psychology actually started as a study of consciousness. So way back when we were talking about, Wilhelm Wundt and his first labs, we talked about this idea of studying humans through introspection, which is them kind of explaining how they are viewing or interacting with the world. And that is really the study of their consciousness, right? Trying to figure out their awareness, what they pay attention to, what they don't, what they notice. But like a lot of things in psychology, there were issues, and it's really hard to study something you can't see. And we didn't have a lot of the technology that we have now, and so we shifted away from consciousness and kind of mental states to studying behavior, right, and rewards and punishments and things we can see. And then in the 1960s, we came back to the idea of studying more cognition or, mental states and consciousness awareness of those states and where you're at and how you feel and think about things. And advances in brain imaging has actually made this possible to see consciousness. So psychologists now, neuroscientists, what they can do is they can actually show you like 10 different objects in an MRI or an fMRI, and they can tell by the brain patterns which of the 10 objects you're looking at. So they can't like read your mind, right? They can't do whole thoughts yet, but we are able to see what you are thinking about and kind of differentiate between different items. Okay, so this is now, this new technology that we have has allowed us to study consciousness in a different way than before. So our current understanding of consciousness works from this idea that there are two tracks of your mind. So we think about like unconscious as the idea of like knocked unconscious. But what I need you to think about is conscious as is like this high track. And it is what you are doing deliberately. So anytime you're trying to solve a really hard math problem or name something or define a word or anything where you're actually physically trying, making decisions, deliberate choices, that's the high track. But we also are finding that your mind, right, works on this lower track. And this is the unconscious track, which is more like an automatic kind of track where you are maybe aware of things, but you don't really know you're aware of them, right? So you're not really paying attention to them, but they're still influencing you. This could be like something as simple as walking, right? But it also can be things like maybe being afraid of something, but not really knowing exactly why. Or it can be like a lot of times when you make a decision about something very quickly, like someone asks you, what do you prefer, this or this? You might think that you're actually making a conscious high track choice. But really, you're usually making a low track choice based on some sort of memory or emotion connected to one of those ideas, and you're not really considering the pros and cons of both. An example of how these two kind of work together. So if you're looking at this picture, this down here of this birds, right? So the high track is like, I see a bird, right? Like it names it, it knows what it is. You maybe know the type of bird or, whatever. But the low track is thinking about like the color, the motion, the form, the depth. All of those things put together that you're not like really breaking down, but you are seeing them, right? And other things that low track is doing is like figuring out if you're afraid, figuring out how fast the bird is coming. Is it coming at you? Do you need to move? Do you like birds? Like these kinds of things are happening without you really knowing about it, or but you're not really aware of it until maybe someone asks you about like, oh, do you like birds? And then you would become aware of it, right? So your mind works on these two tracks kind of all the time throughout your day. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the attention piece of consciousness, right? Like I said, it is your awareness, and how we determine awareness is where you're paying attention, right? So humans have selective attention. You cannot pay attention to everything at once, although we think it might be great, but like it wouldn't. There's so many different senses coming at you, right? All the things your eyes could see, all the things that you could feel, taste, touch, smell, whatever, that your brain filters that stuff out in order for you to like live effectively, right? An example of this is right now, hopefully you're paying attention, you're focusing on me and this video and these notes and this knowledge. But now that I mentioned it, do you feel your socks on your feet? Or do you notice how like your tongue kind of like all of a sudden starts to feel like it's taking over your mouth now that I'm talking about it? Or like you didn't really notice your butt in a chair, but like all of a sudden now you kind of like feeling uncomfortable, right? You're like changing your focus and your awareness. There is a very specific phenomenon that goes along with this called the cocktail party effect. And this is the ability to focus on one voice and ignore other noise or voices around us, and you kind of zoom in and filter out the rest. And what's interesting about this is that you can be zoomed into a conversation and focus on that person, but the minute you hear your name kind of like over there, you can switch your focus, right? And so it's easy for your attention to be diverted, but we are able to like focus in on one and ignore the background. Another example of this kind of, but in a negative way, is the problems with distracted driving. That it's not possible for you to have your awareness on something like your cell phone and the road at the same time, because both of those take attention. And so cell phone users are 4 times more likely at a risk for a crash because their attention when they're on their cell phone is there and not on the road or anything in front of them or etc. Okay, so we have selective attention, but then we also have the opposite of that, which is selective inattention. And this is just the opposite idea that because you're paying attention to some things in your environment, you're focusing on them, you fail to notice other parts of the environment that may be changing or moving or things that may be coming in and out of view, right? And there are 2 kind of examples of this that we like to talk about in psychology. The first one is something called unintentional or inattentional blindness, and the second one is called change blindness. So inattentional blindness is the idea that they have done a lot of experiments, and oftentimes we miss seeing kind of like big, weird things in the environment that other people would think were obvious because we're not paying attention. And this is something that magicians use. They use misdirection, right? So they may be trying to focus your attention, this thing, they're doing this, whatever, but then really there's something else happening that you're missing because your attention is focused. And one of this, if you're wondering what this picture is about, they do this, they test this with the idea of they have people kind of moving in a circle and they're passing some things around, and then they have this gorilla that like walks through the center of the circle, and the people who are watching this are so focused on the passing and the moving and whatever that they actually miss the gorilla, which like sounds crazy, right? Because how can you miss that? But they do, because their attention is not focused there, and so they miss something kind of obvious. The other type of this, or another example of this, is something called change blindness. So this is the idea that when in an experiment, about 2/3 of people, so not everyone, but about 2/3 of people don't notice a major change in the environment because their attention is so focused on something else. So they do this experiment where you see here, this first guy in this first picture, he is asking for directions, right? And then he's interrupted by this big board, which is on purpose. It's part of the experiment. And they change. So this guy changes to that guy. And then there's a new guy giving him directions. And 2 out of 3 people don't even notice it's a new person. They just continue on asking for directions like nothing happened, right? And the question I want to ask you is, did you notice, just in that example right there, that the person that was replaced was wearing different clothes, right? So that's even a small thing that like you may not even have noticed as a change between the 2 people. You noticed they were different, maybe you didn't notice they were wearing different clothes, right? So this is just the introduction to consciousness, and we're going to follow up by talking about, this idea of how now different states of consciousness influence our awareness and our ability to kind of interact with our surroundings. So that's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.